So for the next 7 weeks, we're going to be working on A Christmas Carol, learning about the characters that are in it and talking about it as a novel, and perhaps learning a little about outside the novel as we go along. Alrighty? So to start off with Christmas Carol, the first thing we really need to talk about is the author, Charles Dickens. Charles was born in 1812 and he died in 1870. He was born in February, actually, of 1812. He was the oldest son of his family, and not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. There were more to come after him, but he was the first to be born. He was not only an author, of which he's very famous for, but he was also what we call a social critic. Okay, a social critic is someone who sees social problems in the area that they live in. In this case, it was England, and he tries to do something about them. He wrote about them. He talked about them. He wrote articles about them. How much did he write? Well, he wrote 15 novels. Remember last week we talked about how long a novel is? He wrote 5 novellas, of which A Christmas Carol is one. He wrote hundreds of short stories. He wrote newspaper articles, as well as pamphlets and featured articles in magazines. He also was a lecturer. He gave a lot of lectures as a charity type of thing. People had him come and lecture in order to raise money for foundling homes or orphanages, those types of things. And he also found that people would pay to come and hear him read his own books out loud. So he was doing readings. In fact, that's what he was doing when he died, was traveling around and reading portions of his books in a way that only he could do. And he loved to write letters, so he wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. What kind of social things was he interested in? Primarily children's rights. He was very interested in children. He had 10 of his own, and they all lived to adulthood except for one. One of the youngest girls died when she was 8 months old, but all the rest grew up. And he loved education, and he felt very strongly for education for children. He was a big fan of that. He was also into social reform, particularly for the poor. He had a real heart for the very poor people, for those that were suffering, for those that were out of work, those who were living on the streets. Those were things that charity people, that he called them. In fact, he was very good at giving money to anybody that he met, even sometimes when he didn't have enough money to pay his bills. He is considered the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. The Victorian era was named that because of Queen Victoria, who sat on the throne through that period of time. That lasted from 1837 to 1901. So he was active. You see, of course, he was dead long before the Victorian period was over, but his books were still very much read and very much being passed around. There was no other writer as popular as he was while he was still alive, which is unusual. A lot of writers don't reach their popularity until after they're dead, and sometimes centuries later, where people go back and find their writings and make them out to be very popular. But Charles Dickens was popular, wildly popular, while he was alive and afterwards, which makes him really, really unique. Part of the reason is he's created some of the best known characters that we still recognize, and they're still referenced today. It's not uncommon, particularly around Christmas time, to see cartoons with Scrooge in them. It has become a common word. We put that in our vocabulary. We talk about someone being a Scrooge, about how they act around Christmas time, or they're being a Scrooge with their money, or they're being a Scrooge with their possessions. You see them in commercials all the time. You see them in social media all the time. So you see his characters, and particularly of the Christmas Carol. Scrooge is probably his most famous, and that's the one that you see the most often out. Critics and scholars called him, and still call him, a literary genius. His novels and short stories are still as popular today as they were when he was alive. And that is something that is very, very unique among writers. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about him as a person and about his past. I told you he was born in 1812. He did get married, of course. If he had 10 children, he did. He got married in 1858 to a lady named Catherine Hogarth. His dad's name was John. His mother's name was Elizabeth. John was a Navy clerk for the payroll. He was not paid very much. And so John always was having trouble with money, particularly as his family grew larger, and he was always getting moved around. In fact, Charles Dickens moved like 4 times by the time he was 5 years old to different naval yards where his father had to be put in order to be able to get paid. 1812, we were in a war. In fact, here in the United States, we were at war with England. They didn't really consider it a war. They were at war with France. So they were too busy fighting France to really care a whole lot about us. We had some fights over here. They came and burned down our White House where the Madisons were living, and we had to rebuild it from that. So what little bit of tangling we had, we tangled up until 1815 with them. But then the war was over. They defeated Napoleon. That's who they were fighting in France. And when they did that, the Navy let a lot of their sailors go. And without the sailors, there really wasn't a job for John. So that's one of the reasons that he was so poor, and he had to continually move to different naval yards in order to be able to keep some kind of a job going. Now, not only was he not making a great deal of money, but he wasn't very good with money. John was not good at handling his own money. And like I said, particularly as his family got bigger. So it was not uncommon at this period of time that if your parents came into debt, particularly your father, if your father got overburdened with debts, that they would put him in prison, in what they called a debtor prison, until he could come up with enough money to get back out again. And the bad thing about debtor's prison is that a lot of times they put the whole family there. So when Charles Dickens was 12 years old, John, his father, and his mother, and his other brothers and sisters all went to debtor's prison. But not Charles. Charles was considered old enough to be able to earn a living at 12 years old. And so he was sent to work in a place called Warren's Blacking Factory. So what's a blacking factory? A blacking factory is where they boil down used coal and tar, and they make a blacking for blacking your shoes, like a shoe polish, and also for blacking the stoves that they burn their coal and stuff in, because they get really grody looking. They get kind of rusty looking, and they get dusty looking. And so they made this kind of a liquid blacking to paint them with, to make them look nicer, to keep them longer, keep them going longer. So at 12 years old, Charlie was sent to the Warren Blacking Factory, and he was there for a long time. In fact, over a year. And his job was to take the labels and put glue on them and stick them on the tins that the blacking went into. And that's what he did from about 5 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night, sometimes later than that. And the bad thing, the worst thing of it is that not only did he work there, he had to live there. The boys slept on mats or straw up in the attic around the top of this blacking factory, and it was filthy, dirty, nasty work with rats everywhere. It was just a horrible, horrible situation. And all of the people that worked in there were boys, were young boys. The ones that were stirring the pots coughed all the time because of this burning of coal and tar was in their lungs. So it was a very unhealthy place to be. And not only was it unhealthy, it was a dirty, filthy, dirty. They never changed their clothes. They wore the same thing every day until they were just wearing rags, with the soot and the blackness getting on the roof and the rafters and falling on them while they were doing their work. So it was a very, very nasty place. How much did he earn for working there? Well, he was earning about 6 shillings a week. How much is that, Mrs. J? Well, it's kind of hard to say what 6 shillings back then would be today, because our system is different. Not only do we not use shillings over here, and we haven't since sometime after the Revolution, but buying power of coins has changed. But if you were to take what things cost today and what things cost back then, he was working 7 days a week for about $35 a week is about what he was making, which of course he was having to turn in to his family if he got paid. And that's a big, big if. One of the worst things about these places is that these boys, there were all these little boys, and then there was an older set of boys, and then there was like an overseer, a man who kind of ran everything. And he put the younger boys in the care of the older boys. And the older boys used to mistreat the younger ones. They used to mistreat each other quite a bit. There were bullies that were in there. The older boys used to beat the younger ones, especially if they didn't make their quota that day, if they didn't get enough stuff done. They could be very, very cruel. And there was hints from Charles after he got out and became an adult that there was even sexual abuse that went on the whole time that he was there. They were all very low-class boys. A lot were orphans. And this was the place that they lived, they breathed, they ate. They got a bowl of gruel in the morning and just a handful of stuff to eat at night. So they were very poorly fed. And here is Charlie, whose father is a clerk. So he's a kind of a semi-gentleman. He's not like a rich gentleman with a fancy cane, but he was considered an educated man. And Charlie had been to school. Most of these boys had never been to school. They could not read, they could not write, and they were from the streets, so they were very rough. So Charlie had a really hard time while he was in there, being the cultured young man that he was and desperately wanting to go back to school because he knew he was losing his education, and being in the middle of all these really low-class, rough street boys. It was very, very hard for him. Now, his father was able to negotiate his release after 3 or 4 months, and he wanted Charlie to come out of the blacking factory and come home. But his mother, Charlie's mother, wanted him to stay there and continue earning money to help the family out rather than coming home and them being in debt all the time again. And so she and John, the father, had a pretty big argument about that. And John, the father, won, and Charlie came home. But he never forgave his mother for her wanting him to go back and work there. Now, interesting enough, this is something you need to remember, because this is why in every one of Charles Dickens's books, we always find a lost, persecuted, poor, helpless little child in the middle of his story. That's always Charles. He never forgot that. He never talked to anybody about it very much, but he never forgot that experience. And so he took those children that he was with and he puts them in each of his stories to represent that part of his life. And that's something we're going to look for as we read A Christmas Carol and see if we can find Charles in the middle of that story. All right. Charles grew up a little bit, and in 1834, he began to write for some of the periodicals, some of the magazines that were going out at that period of time. And he wrote little short columns and little short stories. But instead of writing under his name, Charles Dickens, he wrote under a code name. And he called himself Boz. So no one knew who Boz was, who this writing was. Very few people knew who it was, only his publishers. But he started writing in that, and finally there was a publisher who came to him and said, we're getting ready to publish a book that we've got this very famous artist who Charlie knew, who has done all these beautiful illustrations, and we need somebody to just write captions underneath the illustrations, and we're going to put them all together in a book and sell it. And Charles Dickens said, I have a better idea than that. I mean, I will do it, but I have a better idea that I think will sell better for you. He said, rather than making a book of illustrations, and putting it all together and selling it for several shillings that the poor people wouldn't be able to buy, he said, why don't you instead write a story, maybe about 3 chapters at a time of this story, and put the illustrations in there, in this story, and put it together, just sew it together, don't put it in like a binding, and you could sell that on the streets for a shilling a piece, and even the poor people would be able to buy it, and I bet your readership would go up. I bet you'd make a lot more money that way than doing just an illustrated book with no story in it. Well, the publishers never heard of anything like that before. It's called a serial, and they said, we're not sure that's going to work. And Charlie said, well, why don't you take a chance, and if it doesn't work, then we'll go back and do what you want to do. So they agreed. And so Charles wrote the first 3 chapters of a book that he was getting ready, when he got through with it and put it all together, he would call the Pickwick Papers. Okay, a story of these 4 guys who were just traveling around the country, looking at all these fun things. And every week, those 3 chapters, they'd go to a different place. Okay, 3 chapters, they'd go over here. 3 chapters, they'd go to this place. Next 3 chapters would go over there. And it came out every month. And so every month, these 3 chapters with the illustrations would be put out and sold as a serial. Some ongoing writing is what that means. Well, it went great. I mean, it went like crazy. And they sold those, and people got caught up in it, and everyone wanted to know what was going to happen. And then the publishers came back to him, and he said, okay, we want to try that again, but if you're not traveling around to get people's interest, how are you going to keep people's interest in a single story? Because Charles wanted to do it a second time. And Charles said, well, what if at the end of the 3 chapters, we always have one character hanging off the edge of a cliff by his fingers? And they'll have to buy the next to find out what happens to him. And they were like, you can do that? And he said, yes, I can do that. Every 3 chapters, one character is going to have something horrible happening in their life, and they're going to be literally hanging off the edge of a cliff by their fingertips. Well, that's what they did. And the second book that he started was called Oliver Twist. Every 3 weeks, 3 chapters about this poor little boy who lived in an orphanage, and nobody cared about him, and nobody loved him, and nobody wanted anything good for him. He was in terrible trouble all the time. Every 3 chapters, you have this, what we now know as a cliffhanger. That's where the term comes from. Even though Oliver never hangs off a cliff, he still has a point in his life at the end of those 3 chapters where it looks like something terrible is going to happen to him. And you have to start the next chapter to find out if he's going to survive or not. So that's the second book that came out. Now, Oliver Twist was the first book to have a child as the lead character. Nobody had ever done that before at all. You all know Oliver Twist. I know you've heard of that book about the poor little orphan boy who gets sold because he asks for a bowl of food. He says, please, sir, may I have some more? Please, sir, can I have some more? Because he's hungry. And they kick him out of the orphanage and they sell him to a funeral director. In those days, they're called something else. And his job is to walk in front of the hearse carrying the dead children. and look sad, and he's all in black and everything. But he gets in trouble because there's another apprentice there who's very ugly and very mean to him. And so Oliver ends up running away. And he makes it to London and comes into one of the other most famous characters that Charles Dickens has ever made. And that is a man called Fagin. Fagin is a scoundrel, and he has a whole group of boys around him that he takes care of, and he teaches them how to pick pockets and to rob. And they bring everything they get back into him, and he feeds and takes care of them, and lives in this garret up at the top of an old nasty house. So Fagin is another character that is very, very famous. He's probably second, right behind Scrooge. But Oliver Twist, like I said, he's the first time that they use a child. Now, after he wrote Oliver Twist, he was looking for something else to write. And about that time, there were some schools, some boarding schools that began to advertise, if you bring your child to us when they are 2 years old, we will keep them till they are 20 and give them back to you. And you won't have to deal with them while they're small. You won't have to raise the child yourself. You give them to us and we'll do everything. We'll train them, we'll teach them, we'll dress them, and you don't have to have them. You don't even have to come and see them. We will take care of them. These boarding schools got to be really, really popular. And Charles Dickens, because of his interest in education and children, he went to visit one of these schools, and what he found out was horrible. The horrible conditions that these poor children were being put in every day, the meanness of their instructors. They were being beaten all the time. They were being punished very unfairly. They were barely being fed. They were barely being clothed. Their schools were horrible buildings that were falling apart with cracked and broken windows. They had no heat in them. And the children were sleeping at night with snow falling on them because the roofs were so bad. I mean, they were in terrible, terrible conditions. And he felt so bad about that he came back and started his third book right away. And in it, Nicholas Nickleby is in one of those schools. And he tells about the horrible life that he has. Well, that book, by the time he completed his series, it caused such an uproar in England that they put together committees to go and research these schools and go and look at them. And they ended up shutting a whole bunch of them down because they were in such bad shape and they felt that they were so bad for the children. So when that happened, Charles Dickens goes, you know what? I have a great deal of power with my writing. I can change people's minds. I can change my nation by what I write. And he went, I wonder what else I'd like to write about that would change people's mind. Well, that's when he wrote a book called The Old Curiosity Shop. Now, The Old Curiosity Shop is a story about an old man that they call grandfather and his little granddaughter. And they run a store that is just full of junk. They buy things from the children that steal stuff. So everything they have in their store is just kind of a yard sale. But the trouble is that the grandfather is a gambler. And he gets in a lot of trouble. And the bad guy in the book comes looking for him because he owes him money. And so the grandfather takes little Nell, as the little girl is owned, and they begin to run away from this bad guy that's coming, and they travel all over the country. And so again, we have a book where we're traveling, and every week the grandfather and the little girl were going someplace else. And that serial got so popular that even over here in America, people were reading it like crazy. And so we have a situation where Charles Dickens started out with 400 people a week reading his things. And by the time he got to the end of The Old Curiosity Shop, he had 40,000 people reading his story. Now, I'll tell you something funny about this book, though, is there toward the end of the last year on this serial, he was still writing, but he was getting about 2/3 of the way through it. Right at the very end, on those last 3 chapters before we went to a new year, little Nell did something terrible. Little Nell coughed. Now, I know you're thinking, okay, she coughed. Well, see, that's because we live in the 21st century. But back in the 19th century, for someone to cough was like a death stroke. Usually when you started coughing, it meant that you had what they called consumption in the lungs, which we know better as tuberculosis. And it was almost always deadly. And so as he continued to write, the whole world got upset. And he began to get hundreds and hundreds of letters going, is little Nell going to die? Is little Nell going to die? There were even prayer groups that got together and prayed for little Nell that she would not die of this disease. Well, when the last 3 chapters came out, the boat that was carrying all of those, that last little booklet, when it sailed into the harbor of New York, there was 1,000 people on the docks. And as the boat came in, they began to yell, does little Nell die? Does little Nell die? And the sailors who had read on the way across went, yes, she does. And the whole world mourned like she had been a real person that they had all known. Charles Dickens said that that was one of the hardest chapters he ever wrote, was when she died in the book, which he puts together as the book. But he said writing those last few chapters where she is dying, he said he sat and wept as he wrote those because it tore him up so bad, because the character had been so real to him. Now, right after writing The Old Curiosity Shop, he came over here and went on a tour of the United States and of Canada. He was so popular. Everybody was reading his books. They were screaming and yelling, and he would come and lecture in the big lecture halls, and they would hold his books up and wave them back and forth. They were so excited because everyone was so caught up in these books that he had written, and they loved what he was doing, and they loved him as an author. Now, the only trouble was is that I told you he was a social critic. Well, he came over here because there were things here in the United States that he didn't agree with socially. Number one, he was an abolitionist. And so he came over to tell the Americans what he didn't like about slavery. Now, this is in 1842. And the other thing that he didn't like was the fact that there were no copyright laws. And so a lot of the books that were over here that people were reading were pirated books, where somebody had bought his serial and then recopied it and sold it for their own profit. So he didn't get anything out of that. So he came over to talk about the fact that he didn't think that was fair, and again, to talk about what he thought was unfair about slavery. Well, that didn't make him popular everywhere he went. And he actually wrote 2 books while he was over here. He wrote a book called Marvin Chuzzlewit, and it was about a man who lived here in the United States, and in it he put all the things he didn't like about Americans. Primarily, he didn't like the fact that they chewed tobacco and spit. That really made him sick. He thought that was, he said, every place I walk into has a great big spittoon and all the men are spitting at it and they're missing it. It's all over the floor. He thought that was the nastiest habit he'd ever seen. So he wrote about that. And then the other thing he wrote was travels to America. Every time somebody traveled out, any author, they always wrote about their travels. And again, in that book, he wasn't very complimentary about the American people. He said he thought we were rather barbaric and we didn't have any culture. And he was pretty harsh about it. Well, when you write ugly things about your fans, they're not your fans anymore. And the people here in the United States were actually burning his books. They were so angry about it. And they flopped. His sales went from 40,000 back down to less than 400. And all of his profits just plummeted. So he lost a lot of money by doing that. Now, not only did he lose a lot of money, but in the meanwhile, he and Catherine have started having children. And they've got 5 so far, or 4 and 1 on the way. So with 5 children, he needed a better place to live, so he bought a bigger house. And then he remodeled it really nice on the inside so it was really fancy. That takes money. So all of this money he was spending to redo his house and to pay for his family was sucking it right out of him. And he began to get in debt and could not pay them. And then with him having 2 books that flopped, his publishers began to take money out of what they did sell in order to pay for his trip when he came over here to the United States. So he gets in some pretty bad financial mess. And the worst part is he has a writer's block. He can't come up with anything else to write. So here he is now going the same direction that his father did. He has no money or very little money. He's losing money. He doesn't have any money coming in. He's got a family to take care for, a house that he is remodeling with all this fancy stuff, gold and marble, and he's having to pay for all of that, and he doesn't have money to pay for it, and things are looking pretty bleak. He goes and tries to borrow some money. He actually is in debt to a couple of loan people because he's borrowed money to do his fixtures and to fix his house, and now he can't pay them back. So he's getting into a great deal of problem about that. Things are really not looking very good for Charles right at the moment. And he can't come up with an idea to write a book. In early part of 1843, he read a government report on the abuse of child laborers in mines. Now, we're going to talk about child labor next week in England and how it was this period of time. But children working was very common. Children as young as 3, 4, 5 years old working full-time jobs, 60 to 65 hours a week, was very common. And after he read this report, he was horrified to hear about the lives of these poor children that were working in the mines. And he vowed that he would use his power as a writer to strike a sledgehammer blow, is what he called it, a sledgehammer blow on behalf of the poor man's child. The sledgehammer blow that he wrote, he called A Christmas Carol. All right. He started writing A Christmas Carol just 6 weeks before Christmas. That's not very long. Not only is it not a very long time to write, but it is not a very long time to get it typed out, published, and illustrations put in it and put into a book form. He wanted it to come out as a book, a novella, a short novel, still with chapters, but he wanted it to come out all at once. He didn't want it to come out in pieces like this. You see, one thing about Charles is he loved Christmas. He said he remembered that his father, that was the best time of year for his father. And that's what he remembered about his dad the most was Christmas. His favorite time was Twelfth Night or Epiphany. That was the celebration that he enjoyed the most. That's one that we don't tend to do very much here anymore unless you are old-fashioned like we are and we actually do the 12 days of Christmas. But the 12th night is like the big celebration. That's generally where you have a ball and you have a lot going on. But you see, you've got to know that Christmas at this period of time in 1843 was not a major holiday. In fact, it was a little or nothing holiday. A lot of people never even celebrated it because it was not a public holiday. It was a private holiday. It was kind of like we do Thanksgiving. It was a time that you got together with your family and you had a great big meal. And very, very few people celebrate. And you went to church. That was the other thing. You went to church, and then you had a great big meal with your family. That's what it was. There were no gifts. You didn't give gifts. You didn't do that kind of thing at this period of time. The Christmas tree had just come over. It wasn't here. Queen Victoria had only put a Christmas tree up like a year before, maybe 2 years before. So that was a brand new thing. She had married a German prince, and he had brought his Christmas traditions over here with him. And so when they started doing that in the palace and people saw it, it began to spread out. But it's just now getting started, just barely off the ground. When he went to his publishers about this and told them what he wanted to do, they were not interested. They had already lost a lot of money because of the 2 flops that he'd done. Also, he had a great idea for this particular book. He wanted it to be illustrated by his good friend, Mr. Leach, who was like the top illustrator, and it was going to cost a lot to get these, and he wanted them hand colored, not just black and white. He wanted them all colored in. They would all have to be done by hand. And he wanted gold trim on the outside of the pages so that they were gold leaf all around the outside. And then he wanted it put in a really nice binding with gold leaf in the sides on the binding and on the front of the cover. So he really had some high expectations for this book. And first of all, his publisher said, why Christmas? Why don't you just wait and finish it and bring it out in like January or February? Why are you trying to get it out for Christmas? He said, because it's about Christmas. It has to do with Christmas. And they go, why? It's a minor holiday. Nobody's going to care anything about it. You know, nobody buys Christmas anything. And they also said, we don't like all the expenses that you're going to do. That's going to cost a fortune. Even if you gave it to us today to try to get it illustrated and put together and out on the shelves of the bookstores by Christmas would be almost impossible. So Charles said, fine, I'll do it myself. You just say that you'll help with the publishing, but I'll pay all the cost. I'll pay all the printing cost. I'll pay all the book costs, all the drawing. I'll pay all of that because I think it's going to be so successful that people are going to buy it and I'll get all my money back. Plus, and I'm going to make a lot of money on this one. He had high hopes he was going to make a lot of money on A Christmas Carol. He wanted to sell it for 5 shillings. Now remember before when he said, let's keep it for a shilling so that the poor people can afford it? 5 shillings was almost a week's worth of work. That's a lot of money, but it was not enough to really cover all of the expenses for this book. So again, the publisher said, if you're going to do all that fancy stuff with the gold and stuff, we need to charge more. And he said, no. I want to sell it for 5 shillings so that people can afford to buy it. So anyways, Charles went out and he got in touch with Mr. Leach, who was a friend of his. He started writing this story based on things he had heard and of his own past life. You see a lot of Charles Dickens' life in here. And then on December 19th, just a few days before Christmas, the first books were sent to the bookstore. 6,000 books. That's how many they printed the first time. And they sold in 2 days. All 6,000 books in 2 days, sold completely out. It was a huge success. A huge success. But Charles didn't make the money that he'd hoped he would make on that because most of the money that came from the books had to go pay for his publishing costs. So he made very, very little money the first time. But they reprinted it the next year. And this time, he sold 50,000 copies of the book. And he made a little more money on it that time. It still didn't get him completely out of debt, but it did help quite a bit. Now, that was such a high success that he began to go on and write more other stories. But none of them have ever had the pow that A Christmas Carol has had. Christmas Carol changed the way people thought about Christmas. They changed how they celebrated it. It changed mainly on how they looked at those that are poor and beneath us, struggling to survive. And it was probably the biggest social mover of all the books that he wrote, and still is today. Now, I told you that we will see someone that we know in Charles Dickens' life. You probably don't remember it, but I told you this several weeks ago. In 1857, Charles and his wife and 10 children bought a house that he'd looked at for a long time that was out in the country. He wanted it as a summer home, and he called it Gad's Hill. Well, they fixed it up and they moved out, and in the summer of 57, they went there for the summer, for their first summer there all together. And while he was there, he had a visitor that came to visit him. A man that was kind of tall and awkward and a little gawky and wore very brightly colored clothes. You remember talking about that man? That's right, it was Hans Christian Andersen. He was a fairy tale writer, of course, but he admired Charles Dickens so much. And so he came all the way over from Denmark, from Amsterdam, to visit Charles Dickens. And Charles was delighted to see him because he admired him also. And so he asked him if he wanted to stay with him, not realizing that Hans Christian Andersen was going to stay as long as he did. In fact, Hans stayed for well over a month until Charles finally had to ask him to leave. He said, you know, we're going home, we're packing up and leaving, so you got to go home. So Hans Christian Andersen left, and he never came back again. Now, the very next year, in 1858, Charles separated from Catherine. They said it was a mutual understanding and that they separated because Charles was difficult to live with. Being a very moody person and given to highs and lows with his writing, it probably is not uncommon to see that he would be a very difficult person to be around, but we're not sure. They never said much about it. But when he left, all 10 of his children, except for one, went with him, and only one went with her. So the other children that he had stayed with him. A few years later, he was involved in a very bad railway accident. It was not uncommon for trains to fall off places at this period of time. They were not really good on the rails. They weren't really always good at staying on the rails, and there was no way to move them forward or stop them very quickly if you saw something on the tracks. There were 10 people that were killed in that, and his particular car that he and a friend of his and her mother were in fell off the track, but it hung on to the engine. It was the closest one to the engine, so it hung. So even though they fell down to the bottom of the car, they did not fall into the ravine and into the water like the other ones did. So that shook him up really badly. He did what he could for the people that were suffering. He went back into the car and got his brandy bottle and got his hat, and he filled his hat full of water out of the river, and he tried to go and help the people that were there. He said there was one woman that he went by who was sitting under a tree, and he gave her a drink of brandy and stayed with her for a little while, and then he left, and when he came back, she was dead. So he was a hero from that, but it shook him up and it made him afraid to travel by rail, and he didn't do a whole lot more of that. But it also messed up his health, and 2 years later he had a stroke, and the doctor told him that he needed to slow down. He was doing his reading, he was traveling the country, he was traveling over here to the United States and doing his reading on these programs, these lecture halls, and the doctor said, if you don't slow down, you're going to kill yourself. But in 1870, he suffered a second stroke and died the next day. So that is the story of Charles Dickens, and hopefully we're going to be able to see some of the things that I talked about as we go through the book together.